Hello guys, I do hope and pray that you are fine wherever you are. I want to kindly thank all my viewers and kindly request that if you bump upon this video, kindly like them, share and subscribe to this platform. That aside, I want to talk about the credibility of the United Nations. The United Nations has played a very significant role in maintaining world peace since its establishment in 1945. We all remember that the United Nations was formed in 1945, immediately after the end of the Second World War. This organization replaced the League of Nations, which, according to the founders of the United Nations, the League of Nations failed to prevent a World War II. Since the formation of the United Nations in 1945, it has played critical roles in preventing wars. But at the same time, the United Nations has attracted a fair share of criticism from world leaders. Many believe that the United Nations has been compromised. Compromised in the sense that this organization has become partial. Many leaders believe that the United Nations is being controlled by a few permanent members of the organization. You remember, permanent members of the United Nations have overriding roles, which to some, like me, a historian, I would call them veto powers. These permanent members have an ability to restrict and allow certain policies in the world. African leaders, to be specific, have considered the United Nations, especially the judiciary branch of the United Nations, the ICC, International Criminal Court, to be partial. African leaders and many, let me say, elites have maintained that the ICC is targeting African presidents and African leaders. They have argued that the ICC is being used by some very few permanent members of the United Nations to target and sabotage African leaders. This was emphasized by the Ugandan president Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. The same was emphasized by the former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. But in some sense, I see credibility of these critics. I see credibility in these statements. The ICC has always, let me say, sanctioned, issued warrant of arrests to individual African leaders for their purported crimes against humanity. These leaders are sometimes taken to the court for participation in genocide, killing of innocent civilians. I don't dispute these facts. Like in my country, Kenya, the former president Uhuru Kenyatta and the current president William Samoei Ruto were taken to the ICC for their central roles in the 2007-2008 post-election violence. Why am I saying that I support, to some extent, I support the arguments by African leaders that the ICC has become partial, that the United Nations has been compromised? These leaders were taken to the ICC for crimes against humanity. But I ask a very simple question. Why hasn't the ICC invited the former president of the United States, George W. Bush? You remember, for those who are abreast with history, for those who are abreast with facts, and for those who are abreast with world news. You will remember that George Bush admitted that the United States and its administration erred in the killing of Saddam Hussein. The killing of Saddam Hussein, I don't see it as killing an individual. I see it as crimes against Iraq, crimes against the old Iraqis. Why hasn't the ICC invited George Bush? And why hasn't the ICC invited other accomplices to the killing of Saddam Hussein? You will find the ICC inviting and issuing warrant of arrests to African leaders for their purported participation in crimes against humanity. That is my view, and that is my reasoning why I believe that these African leaders who argue that the ICC wing of the United Nations has been compromised by particularly the United States, which is a permanent member of the United Nations. There has been also some arguments concerning the United Nations Security Council's authority on arms embargo. Arms embargo is a policy by the United Nations to restrict individual countries, individual governments from selling arms to other countries. In the list of countries which have received arms embargo from the United Nations are, among others, the Central African Republic, DRC, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Lebanon, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan. Those are countries which have received arms ban, arms embargo from the United Nations. And others include Eritrea, Iran, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Yugoslavia, Zimbabwe, Guinea, China, Cuba, Armenia, Argentina, Syria, Turkey, and Vietnam. Some of these countries in the list that I have just given have been banned from selling weapons to other countries or in the global market because of their purported involvement in others' conflicts. Recently, the United States issued a statement that North Korea is violating the world order, the United Nations restrictions on the sale of weapons. Remember, North Korea is under the UN arms embargo, and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently met with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin in an attempt to sell arms to Russia. The United States and the UN consider this a violation of global order, global rules. But I have a question. North Korea, it becomes a problem when North Korea sells arms to Russia. It becomes a problem when North Korea supports Russia with weapons. It becomes a problem and a violation of global order when North Korea engages in diplomatic talks with Russia. But it is not a problem when the United States and other NATO members supply weapons to Ukraine. It is not a problem when the United States and other NATO members, support Ukraine militarily. It is not a problem when the United States and other NATO members support or engage in diplomatic talks with Ukraine. Are there two rules that the United Nations applies? Are there two rules that the United Nations Security Council applies on guiding the issue of arms and weapons? If it is a global violation, a violation of the United Nations policies and rules, if Russia engages with North Korea, or if North Korea sells weapons to Russia, then the same rules should apply when the United States sends weapons to Ukraine, when NATO sends weapons to Ukraine. With these developments, I see the arguments that the United Nations has been compromised. The United Nations is working to sabotage some members, some countries, but at the same time working to protect the interests of other permanent members like the United States. I believe the United Nations was formed for one reason: to prevent wars, to maintain world peace. If maintaining world peace requires issuing arms embargo, this should apply to all countries. It should apply to the United States, it should apply to Russia, it should apply to North Korea, it should apply to China and many other countries. The law should not be applied selectively. The United Nations should not be selective in administering justice, in executing its duties. I urge the United Nations, and I urge the United Nations Security Council, I urge the ICC, International Criminal Court, to be impartial, not to be selective. And in that way, most of these ongoing wars will be ended, and wars which might emerge will be prevented. Thank you.